Okay, so that was Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Now we can move on to point 4. The objective of the beneficiary of logistical grace. Who's the beneficiary? You are. So what is the objective of this? We already know what the purpose of logistical grace is. And we saw up here as part of our definition. So the purpose of protecting, of providing, of supporting, of sustaining the advance of the believer to super grace status. Now what are you supposed to do? What is your objective now with this logistical support? The believer must exploit and thus increase this grace, but it depends on his attitude towards Bible doctrine. The failure to increase grace will result in divine discipline. So you are a beneficiary of logistical grace. The problem is, do you even know you're a beneficiary of logistical grace? Because a lot of Christians do not know. You must understand these things, and it all boils down to learning Bible doctrine. How are you going to understand these principles, such as the mechanics of logistical grace that we just covered, without understanding something about God's essence, His righteousness, His justice, His love, eternal security, temporal security? How are you going to understand these things without understanding Bible doctrine? Therefore, you need Bible doctrine to understand God's logistical grace. And then that's when you begin the exploitation of His grace. But you first must understand it. You cannot use what you do not understand. Heck, even if you have a weapon, a real life, a sword, a gun, you must know something about that gun. You must respect that gun. And how do you respect that gun? By learning something about it. And as you learn, you're finally going to be able to use it, and use it wisely. Even a gun, a sword, even a dagger, there's some certain principles that you must understand about using this. Respect the weapon by learning something about it. And then once you learn something about it, you have increased your ability to use it. Same with the Word of God. Same with all the assets that you were given at salvation, such as the logistical support, which is now in phase 2 post-salvation. You must understand it in order to utilize it. Without understanding it, you're not going to be able to use it. Even if a believer does not understand his logistical grace, he's still a beneficiary of it, but he cannot exploit it. The believer who does not understand logistical grace falls into the category of receiving God's grace in vain, as we saw in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1. Chapter 6, verse 1. I think I can look at that one right now. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1. And I just remembered that I did not include this verse in my document here. Okay, I can improve it later on. And so it says, and so therefore, but since we are working together, we also urge you that you stop receiving the grace of God in vain, to no purpose, fruitlessness. If you are a believer and you're not advancing in the plan of God, you are receiving God's grace in vain. There's nothing in between. Either you're increasing it or you're receiving it in vain. Why is it in vain? Why is it saying that you receive it in vain? I'm not doing anything. Exactly, you're not doing anything. The fact that you're sitting there as a saved believer with this whole salvation package dropped into your lap, with logistical grace supporting you every single day in Satan's world, giving you the opportunity to arrive at super grace, and you're not doing anything about it, you're receiving God's grace in vain. And verse 2, obviously, let me just go ahead and read it, since I know the translation. For it says, or do I know the translation? At the acceptable time, the time of favor, at the acceptable time, I heard you. This is Isaiah 49:8, that talks about the second advent. With the tribulation, where the Jews were about to be destroyed, but they were rescued right on time. And so at the right time, the appropriate time, acceptable time, I heard you. And the day of rescue, deliverance, I came to your aid. I rescued you. And then he says, listen. Now it applies it to the church age. Listen, now is the completely acceptable time in the church age with all the great things that you have been given. Now is the time to advance. Listen, now is the day of salvation, rescue, deliverance, preservation, all the way to super grace. Okay. So, you must understand something about what you have. It's part of knowing yourself as well. Now you're not just a person that is an unbeliever and he's his own person. Now you belong to God. And part of knowing yourself in the plan of God has to do with knowing what he has given you. Do you not know this about yourselves, that Christ is in you? Remember 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5? Examine yourselves for the purpose of approval. Okay, point 5. We might be able to finish this doctrine today. Point 5. The goal of the beneficiary of logistical grace. Okay, so the objective is to increase this grace, obtain momentum. But the only way to do it is to learn Bible doctrine. But what is the goal? The goal is this. This is the ultimate goal. What is the goal of you with this logistical grace? The goal is to arrive at super grace, spiritual maturity. These are just one of many names for spiritual maturity. Super grace implies the fact that you increased this logistical grace all the way to arriving at a point where you increased it so much all the way to spiritual maturity. That's why I like to keep my pastor's term, super grace. He stopped using this term, I think, after 1986, if I'm not mistaken. He stopped using it, but I like to keep it because it portrays the mandate of increasing grace and increasing grace and increasing grace all the way to super, above grace, more grace. So spiritual maturity, and this results in the glorification of God in time. One of the things that glorifies God is the fact that you can be blessed in the devil's world, that you did not take anything from the devil in terms of blessing and happiness, but everything, all your blessing and all your happiness comes from God. And so 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. We've gone over this verse. And it says, here's the NIV down here, Reina Valera down here in case your paisas need it. So, for ta panta, all these things that he just mentioned, he's talking about them suffering so as to shine their light to the Corinthians so that they can shine their light, that is, advance in the plan of God, all the way to super grace. For all these things are because of you, for your sake, you Corinthians, for you. And then we have a purpose clause, hina. Let's go very literal. In order that, or in case you want it already, so that, hey, charis, this is the nominative case. And so we're going to look for the main verb, not yet, because we have a participle here that goes with this nominative. It is in the nominative as well. Charis is nominative, feminine, singular. The participle is nominative, feminine, singular, so we conclude that it goes with this. Charis pleonasasa, so the grace having increased. Pleonazo means to increase, to grow, to multiply. And it's the aorist active participle. It's not articular, notice that, so it doesn't work as an adjective or anything like that. This is actually what's it called? Circumstantial. It's adverbial. The grace having increased. Pleonasasa. Aorist tense, this is a culminative aorist. First of all, the aorist tense regards into one entirety, every single day, increasing grace and increasing grace and increasing grace, because you make daily decisions for the divine power sphere, learning Bible doctrine, being filled with the Holy Spirit. And so you increase grace every single day, and it regards it into one entirety. But it emphasizes it from the results. You increase it all the way to the glorification of God. Here, so that grace having been increased, the active voice, the Corinthians produced the action of the verb of making daily decisions for the divine power sphere, increasing grace. The only way to increase grace is to learn Bible doctrine. That's the only way to utilize your grace assets. And the participle is circumstantial here. Grace having been increased. Why having do I translate like that? Because the aorist tense here precedes the action of the main verb. The main verb is periseuo. Let's remain here first of all. Grace having been increased. Dia plus the genitive of means here of polus. Here's pleionon. Through the more. Polus means many already, but this is comparative. Through the more. That's in the neuter. Through the more numbers, more people, more of you Corinthians. Look at the NIV translation here. It's talking about, look how they translate it, about reaching more and more people, as in sharing the gospel with more and more people, to the point that more people come to the gospel and grace is increased in that way. Yes, it is true that that's a way to increase grace, by bringing more people into the gospel, more believers being saved. But here it is not talking about unbelievers being saved. It's talking about all these things are for you, Corinthians. In order that grace, having been increased through the more numbers of you, Corinthians, more Corinthians increasing this grace, more Corinthians advancing all the way to super grace. Through the more. And so, periseuo might cause, in order that the grace having increased through the more might cause to abound. What? Cause to abound what? Thein eucharistian. So this is the main verb, aorist active subjunctive. So aorist tense of periseuo, again, regards in one entirety, collects in one entirety, the increase, the abounding. Many people arriving at super grace to the point that they give grace back as thanksgiving. But regards it to emphasize it from its result. The result is you giving grace back to God, which is known as thanksgiving, grace giving. Eucharistian, good grace. It's one of the gratitude of super grace in the devil's world. You are so thankful to God that God is glorified. The active voice, the Corinthians produce the action of the verb, and the subjunctive is part of purpose. The Corinthians have not arrived at super grace yet. They're on their way. And we just saw in our chapter 8, that Paul is in fact testing the legitimacy of their own love, their own child, to see if they've arrived. Super great was not spiritual self-esteem. In spiritual self-esteem, grace is increased. But in gate 8 of the divine power sphere, that's when you are said to be in spiritual maturity, super grace. Okay, and the active voice is the Corinthians, the subjunctive mood is a purpose clause. What do we have this far? For all these things are because of y'all, you Corinthians, so that grace having been increased through the more numbers, you might cause to increase, or to abound rather, the thanksgiving, and then a's plus the accusative result, resulting in the doxan, in the glory, resulting in the glory to the of God. The only place to glorify God in this world is at spiritual maturity, at super grace. Therefore, you must increase this grace all the way to super grace. And so we have James chapter 4, verse 6 as part of our documentation here. Chapter 4, verse 6. Next video really quick.